Welcome to this weekend's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can read more about us at tertiumquids.org, and if you're looking for previous episodes of the program, we keep a YouTube channel with all of them up there in archive fashion, so you can go back and look up some of your favorite guests. One of the hottest topics right now, and I know it's not burning up the barbecue circuit, but it is all over the political world of intrigue, is this movement against the Electoral College. And it is going through the progressive population the same way the Convention of States is going the other way through the conservative population. But I think we're up to something along the lines of 20 states that have decided that they don't want to be relevant in presidential politics anymore. They are all ironically flyover states. And to talk with us about this is policy analyst with the Heritage Foundation, John York. John, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
Good. How are you?
Well, if I wasn't watching the country do some of the most bizarre things, in a world where I quite honestly don't think we have enough representation, we've got people who are voting to give theirs up.
Right.
How are they being sold this bill of goods?
Well, getting rid of the Electoral College is something that creeps up from time to time. I think it's gaining more traction now, especially among Democrats because of the last election. As you probably know, Hillary Clinton won by a very thin margin the popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. It wasn't that long ago that Al Gore won by a thin margin, but lost in the Electoral College. So, no surprise, many of these states, even, and as you say, some smaller ones and some in quote-unquote flyover country, many of them are blue states,
right,
among other things. So, that's, I think, where the push is coming from now, and it's too bad because it's radically unconstitutional and would also lead to these states being quite irrelevant when it comes to selecting the president.
I was told, now I know that if you take New York City and Los Angeles out of the popular vote from 2016, Hillary doesn't win the popular vote.
Right.
I was told that it's even scarier than that. If you took Manhattan and I think Los Angeles County out of the out of the popular vote, she doesn't win. So dominating was her victory in those two downtown counties. But that was the whole point of the Electoral College, was so that two population centers didn't dominate the political scene.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the founders had a lot of things in mind when they designed the Electoral College, but certainly one of them was ensuring that candidates would have to campaign across the country and that one or a few major metropolitan areas didn't govern politics. Now, Democrats will come back and they'll say, well, is that any different than swing states dominating? And I think it is, because swing states change from election to election, whereas New York has been the most popular city for a long time, as has L.A. been. So you'd really have those same population centers. Not only would they be dominating in one election, but election over election over election.
Well, I want to ask you something esoteric and then something concrete. So I'm going to go with the esoteric first, because, John, I feel like part of the narrative that has started since that fateful August day in 2016 when WikiLeaks published John Podesta's emails, and we started to see the finagling behind the scenes, and then add to that Donna Brazil's autobiography, in which she admits that the Clinton Foundation basically bought the DNC by bailing that out. So now it made sense, at least. But what this movement seems to me to be driven by is the narrative that we're not smart enough. This is why they won't address the fact that what WikiLeaks published has never, not one time been contested. Nobody has said, no, it was a lie. Everything in there, nobody has ever denied what we saw. We saw the truth. We saw behind the curtain. Yet the narrative for the next 2 years was Russia collusion. Russia's fooled us. Russia, finagled with our elections. I hear Mark Warner just last weekend was saying the same thing. We've got to protect ourselves from these Russians manipulating our elections. What offends me is what he's saying to me is, I'm too smart to make my own voting decision. Therefore, the Russians fooled me into voting for Donald Trump, or the American people into voting for Donald Trump, and they wouldn't have done it otherwise. And I think that's part and parcel of what's driving this national popular vote is the idea that, the flyover country residents are rubes from the sticks who can be fooled by the Russians into voting for the wrong guy. So we really should put it in the tough cities of New York and L.A. where, Frank Sinatra said if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Is that making any sense, or am I wearing aluminum foil underpants?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm not sure about it. I can't speak to that, but I can say that, I think there's a general inclination on the left now, and it's too bad, that if the rules of the game make it too difficult for them, instead of changing their tactics or changing their message, they want to change the rules. I mean, the best case scenario would be that Democrats would realize, we're becoming a regional party. Our voters are really concentrated in a few cities because our message isn't appealing to broad swaths of the American geography, and we should maybe change our tactics a little bit and run different candidates and maybe try to include broader swaths of the geography of America and the interests that are spread across the country into our platform. But that's not what they're doing. They're going in the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think it's foolish because imagine if Donald Trump said after 2016 it would be easier to run a popular candidacy for the popular vote. So they keep assuming, and he may be right, they keep assuming, the Democrats, that they would nothing would change on the other side of the aisle if we were to move to a national popular vote, and Republicans would still be as unpopular in L.A. and New York as they are now. But, of course, the Republican Party would change how it runs. And, in fact, you'd have Republicans and Democrats both focusing on New York City and L.A., and that would be very bad.
And let's not forget, L.A. and New York have had Republican mayors in my lifetime, so it's not like they don't win there.
That's right.
All right, John York is on with us, policy analyst with the Heritage Foundation, and we're talking about this movement about the Electoral College. Now I'm going to take the more concrete and perhaps wonky approach. I would make the case to the Democrats that what they really should want, and I think conservatives are already on board with this, is more along the lines of what Iowa does, where each congressional district chooses their elector based on who wins that district. So, for example, Virginia has 13 electoral votes, one for each congressional district and the 2 senators. So you win the popular vote in Virginia, as Hillary did. You get those 2 votes. But actually, Donald Trump carried more of the congressional districts, so you might wind up with Hillary getting 7 to Donald Trump's 5. But it's not all 13 to Hillary. But that would also benefit them in states like red states like Wyoming, where maybe around Cheyenne they do get a few electoral votes that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. That's a position James Madison eventually came to later in his life. Not for the reasons Democrats suggest. There was all sorts of other reasons for that. But he did come to the position that maybe these House districts, apportioning delegates that way rather than a winner-take-all system in a state would be a better approach. And 2 states do this. Maine and Nebraska.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was Iowa. I thought it was.
Excuse me. No, it is. It's Maine and Nebraska. But you got it right. Right region. It's one of the grain belt states. I think the reason more states don't go in that direction, because I think it's logical and makes a lot of sense, especially like, for instance, in states like Virginia, where there's a lot of regional diversity between, let's say, Northern Virginia and the rest of the state.
Right.
I think the reason they don't do that, though, is that big pot of votes that's available to a candidate that swings a state makes it more likely that state gets some amount of attention. So if you have a big pot of votes that's going to go to the winner of 50% plus one of the vote, that's the bigger prize. That's the gold ring that people are going to be more likely to chase after. That's something to consider. The other thing is it would really increase the amount of tension and friction that surrounds redistricting, because obviously redistricting would decide not only control of the House, but now perhaps also control of the White House. So those two considerations aside, again, this is a position that Madison came to, and for states like Virginia, it might make a lot of sense.
John, I'm going to ask you another question then, because you've hit a double-point score word here in Virginia, and that's redistricting. I have dear friends that run the One Virginia 2021 campaign, which is about gerrymandering. And I've actually convinced one member of their board named Perriello, one member of their board who's a conservative, George Allen, agrees with me that perhaps it's not so much gerrymandered as undermandered. And I go back to, I think it was 1916 or 1915 when the House voted under procedural vote, and it isn't written into the Constitution or anything, to stop expanding the size of the U.S. House of Representatives and capping it at 435 members. We now have congressional districts where each congressman represents somewhere on the order of 800,000 people. We just watched the Israeli Knesset, which has almost as many political parties as they have seats, but each seat only represents about 60,000, a little bit more than 60,000 Israeli citizens. I feel like part of the problem is we just don't have, and it's horrible because it doesn't sound like a conservative principle, I just don't think we have enough representation in Washington. And that, I think, both from Democrat and Republican side, it feeds this feeling like they're not being listened to.
Yeah, that's an idea I've heard a lot more recently, and I think there's something to that. I mean, the idea, when you look back at the Federalist Papers and the debates at the Constitutional Convention, the idea was that the Senate would sort of be auspicious men with great, strong reputations really throughout a state, so somewhat famous. And then the House would be, turn over more regularly, be closer to the people, be more have their finger more on the pulse of the public. And I think as you get more and more constituents under each member of the House, it does become less in line. The House and the Senate are somewhat less different insofar as the House isn't really able. A House member isn't maybe necessarily able to keep their finger on the pulse of their district in the same way. So there's something there. I mean, you look at the Knesset and it's sort of a horror show, and you think, well,
is it a horror show though? Is it really, or is that how a representative parliamentary government, and again, different organization than ours, is supposed to work? If we can't get a coalition, I guess what's the old rule? When in doubt, leave it out. If you can't get to yes, then the answer is no. Yeah,
I think having a bicameral system like ours would tamp down on the danger of a truly dysfunctional House. I mean, you have I don't think you'd want to have the entirety of Congress functioning under that model, because you might have, as the founders feared, the passions of the people just changing the law too often, too irregular federal code. So I think that it's good in our system where we have a Senate that is more
collegial,
above the churn of popular opinion. But I mean, counterbalancing that, maybe a House that was more involved, more in that churn, having its finger on the pulse of the changing will of the public would be a better counterbalance than what we have now. That's something I haven't thought through carefully enough, but it's certainly worth considering, and on its face, definitely in keeping with the founders' vision.
Well, and certainly it changes our discussion since and I'm going to circle this back around to the Electoral College, since those electors are apportioned by congressional districts. If we got back to a more constitutional apportionment, then that means there are more electors, which means if you do the proportional allocation of the electors, you can have a better representation of it, and therefore, again, less likely. I think the more you centralize things, the more likely it is that they get co-opted and or behave inartfully, I guess is the best word for it.
let's imagine. I think that's right. Although imagine that there were, I don't know, let's say 3,000 members of the House. I mean, maybe that's a high number, but the closer you get to, the larger the House becomes and the smaller these districts become, the closer an electoral college wherein delegates were split up by House district, the closer that looks to a national popular vote. So the great thing about swing states and a winner-take-all system is that you have candidates traveling around the entirety of the state.
Right.
So, you have a state like Ohio, which has urban centers and rural areas and suburban areas, and you see presidents traveling to all three and, stopping at that coffee shop in a small Ohio town and then going to Cleveland, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really great because rural interests are very different. Agricultural interests are very different than the interests that exist in a large city. So the closer you got to a system where the system you were just describing, it would seem presidents would be incentivized to focus on population cores. So that would be a concern.
Last one for you, John, and it's everybody's favorite whipping girl. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But the point I bring up to folks is that she is the creation of 15,000 people. Her district in New York is just over 800,000 citizens. And in that primary, she got 15,000, and her opponent, the incumbent, had 11,000 votes. So, in a district like that, when it's so incompetitive, where it's so blue and it's like, all right, I don't need to worry about this, it's,
right.
Fait accompli, that sort of leads to the voter apathy that puts us at a place where maybe this November here in Virginia, we've got the entire General Assembly, an assembly that's been around for 400 years now, John, but we may see districts with 20% voter turnout. And it's exactly what John Adams warned about when he did his studies on democracies, was that people, stop showing up because they just feel like, it's been decided already.
Yeah, that's a tough – I mean, that's one of the arguments that some on the left used to argue for a national popular vote, because they say, well, in safe states, exactly what you said occurs, and people, they stay home because they know, well, California is going to the Democrats, or I don't know, Georgia to the Republicans, although that's less and less a certainty. But I think that can be true to some extent, although primaries like the one Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won, and then off-year state elections are typically quite low, whereas national popular elections during the general election, it's strange. It's strange how little there's variation in turnout from safe states to swing states. You'd expect huge amounts more turnout in Ohio than California, for instance, but it just doesn't happen. And I think that people typically come out to vote not because they think their vote is going to be determinative. After all, that's like winning the lottery, I guess. But more because of a felt obligation. And in general elections for the president, that felt obligation is quite high, whereas in off-year state elections, it's apparently a bit lower. And I think that has a lot to do with the diminishing power of the states and maybe municipalities and such, more than it does feeling as though your vote won't be determinative. So, I mean, I guess that's an argument in favor of federalism more than anything.
John York is on with us from the Heritage Foundation. He with the Simon Center for Principles in Politics, and writes extensively on the media. Or lately anyway, on the media. And as Mark Warner, we circle back to where we were talking about the Russian collusion argument, and Mark Warner, amongst others, still want to make you feel like they need to clamp down on social media, and Mark Zuckerberg, like so many other oligarchs of their day, said, "Oh yes, please punish me. I'll help you regulate my industry and keep my competition from starting up." Are we at a dangerous place because the internet created such an opportunity for voices to be heard? that maybe this is just the natural and understandable reaction of a state to say, hold on, we got to organize this. But I even recall during the Arab Spring in Egypt, Barack Obama wistfully during a Rose Garden ceremony said, boy, I wish I could shut off the internet sometimes, because that's what Musharraf had done in Egypt. This Honest Ads Act and all the other movement towards clamping down on free speech is dangerous, I feel, or do you feel like there's a good way we can do some of this?
Well, so just the Honest Ads Act, for those of you or those in the audience that maybe have not heard of it, is something that Mark Warner has endorsed along with Klobuchar and Lindsey Graham to bring a lot of the regulation to more heavily regulate political speech on the internet, which is extremely dangerous. Right now, it's relatively unregulated compared to TV ads and radio ads, and that's a good thing, I think. And they're using as a sort of wedge to break into this space the threat of Russian collusion. Of course, the scope of Russian collusion was not. It's serious. It's serious that they had the intention to interfere with the election, but it wasn't quite as great as people suspect when you look at the entire scope of tweets, et cetera. There's billions, and they paid for very few, hundreds of thousands, in that huge ocean. That's a relative drop in the bucket. And much of what the Honest Ads Act would do would really not target Russian interference at all. Like, for instance, they want to put disclaimers on paid ads on the internet. Well, I very much doubt the Russians are going to be buying a lot of ads, and saying, well, this ad paid for by the Russian intelligence agency.
Well, because that's not what they did. Is they set up sites that looked like there were tens of thousands of followers, and then you were made to think, oh, well, tens of thousands of people agree with me. That's how supposedly the fooling happened.
That's how they were doing it, exactly. Not by and large. They were paying for some ads, but very few. What they were mostly doing is setting up these Russian troll accounts and producing tweets, et cetera. Although, like I said, the number of tweets that they were churning out was a relative drop in the drop in the ocean compared to the amount of tweets that are tweeted, I guess, every day. But nonetheless, important. I don't want to diminish that, but it's just that the Honest Ads Act doesn't really confront that. It confronts more domestic speech. And you said it earlier. I mean, sort of much of what the Democrats, much of what the left does is sort of treat us like idiots, as though we're going to see a tweet and be completely moved by it, or as though the sum total of what I think about politics is just the admixture of everything I see online.
Right.
Of course, that's crazy, right?
Right.
Like we have, by the time we're adults, have pretty firm opinions, and it's really difficult to move those opinions in one direction or the other.
Sure.
But
if anything,
many people
the rancor
who are talking about Russian interference and campaign ads generally treat us or have this idea that we're these benighted, poor souls that have to be insulated from all these corrupt actors.
Well, and at the end of it, I think, what you wind up finding is still two media sources. And this is my own personal view, and this is actually confirmed by some folks. And now Mark Zuckerberg and some of the other folks have said, yes, we're going to take action against some of these people that we think are fake websites and everything. I said, great. You're now admitting that you're a publisher. You're like Time Magazine. You're like the Washington Post. So you now can be held liable if somebody is found publishing slanderous or I guess it would be libelous things in your publication. I don't have a problem with that because I have friends. I can email them directly if I need to get in touch with them. I worry that people on the conservative side are conflating having a Twitter account to free speech. Is there a danger that we can overplay that, John, as we finish up here?
I think you put it exactly right. I mean, the Congress made a carve-out for Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, in law that allowed them to grow.
Yeah.
It said they will not be treated, like Facebook and Twitter and these other social media platforms will not be treated like a newspaper, because then they would be, if little Timmy says something mean about little Johnny that's not true, then Facebook shouldn't be sued for libel. Whereas if I write a letter to the editor and it publishes it and it's not true, I suppose a newspaper would be. Or if I was a freelance writer, like the lady at Rolling Stone, Rolling Stone is on the hook.
That's a great example. I go back to Sabrina Erdely all the time. I said, Rolling Stone is done because of the settlements they had to come up with because of that.
Whereas Facebook and Twitter were insulated by law from all these pressures. So it seems to me that if they're backtracking and now they're doing the work of an editor, then they should be held responsible for doing the work of an editor.
Yeah.
So, and if they're not, then they've kind of gone back on the deal they breached, or they're breaching the deal they made with Congress in a way. Congress walled them off from that pressure under the understanding that everyone was going to have access to this platform. If that's no longer the case, then it doesn't make sense to wall them off from lawsuits any longer. That's my view.
Well, I appreciate everything that you do at the Heritage Foundation. It's always been and hopefully always will be one of those go-to sites for conservative thought, and anything that traces roots back to Russell Kirk is okay by me. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time this weekend. I hope you have a great remainder of the weekend. Again, you can look him up at heritage.org and interact with him through there and post emails, ask questions. John York, policy analyst, thank you so much for taking a whole lot of time out with us this weekend. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you. Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, author Myron Magnet and his new book, The Lost Constitution. Not even out yet. We're going to talk about it coming up on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.